This video is not made for kids. It is for older fans and adults only. So fuck off and enjoy the video.
On a cool summer evening, Daisy ventured down the branch line on her last journey of the day. Save for the hum of her engine, there wasn't a sound to be heard. She rounded the bend towards Hackenbeck Tunnel and tooted cheerfully at the Kindleys, who smiled and waved as they sat out front their little cottage. "You know," she said, backing down next to Toby at the sheds, "I've traveled up and down the branch line too many times to count, but I never tire of seeing the Kindleys." "I couldn't agree more," smiled Toby. "But you know, there was a time I dreaded going by that little cottage." Daisy was most surprised. "What? You don't mean to tell me you were frightened of dear Mrs. Kindly? She doesn't have a bad bone in her body," she scoffed. "Oh, heavens no," chuckled Toby. "It wasn't Mrs. Kindly I was afraid of. It was something else." Toby was grateful to have a new lease on life. Since coming to the island, he'd met many friendly people, and the scenery along Thomas's branch line put him in mind of his old tramway. His favorite place on the line was the Kindleys' cottage. Mrs. Kindly was in good health during this time, and she and her husband were often gardening as Toby passed. When he rang his bell, they waved back and called, "Hello." Toby always felt happier after seeing the Kindleys. It was ironic that Toby's favorite place on the line was followed by his least favorite, the Hackenbeck Tunnel. It wasn't particularly long or dark, but as he passed through it, Toby couldn't help feeling uneasy. He tried his best to brush it off. Bringing it up to Thomas only led to teasing. One afternoon, Toby was bringing stone from the quarry to the top station. As they came down the line, the familiar cottage came into view, and Toby rang his bell at the waving couple. Then he plunged into the tunnel. Toby grew nervous. Somehow, he felt he wasn't alone in the tunnel. "Ouch!" came a cry from his cab. His brakes screeched on as he exited the tunnel, stopping in the daylight. His fireman jumped down from the cab and paced beside the line. He was clutching his hand, a pained look on his face. The driver got down. "What's happened?" he asked. "I was shaping Toby's fire," winced the fireman, "when a piece of coal flew out of the firebox." He uncovered his hand, revealing an angry burn. "I'll see if the guard has a first aid kit," said the driver. "No," said the fireman sharply. "I'll be fine. Let's just get to Tidmouth. I'll tend to it there." As they set off again, Toby felt bemused, guilty, and upset. They arrived at Tidmouth to find James waiting for the stone trucks. "You're late," he snapped. "No wonder your little tramway closed, if this is how you dawdle about." Toby fumed. "It wasn't my fault," and he explained what happened. James just laughed. "Well, I've had my share of bad coal, but to spit it out in disgust? That's something new." And he puffed away, chortling to himself. "Don't let him get to you, old boy," said the fireman. Toby glanced at the fireman's bandaged hand. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said hastily. "In all my years of service, I've never had anything like this happen." The fireman chuckled. "No need to fret, Toby. It's nothing serious. Should heal in a matter of days. In the meantime, I'll have to work on my reflexes in case this happens again." Toby smiled, but still felt very guilty. A few days later, Toby was making a return journey to Ffarquhar with Henrietta and Elsie, the luggage van. Gray skies loomed ahead, and distant thunder rumbled across the valley. "Nasty weather," grumbled Elsie. "Whoever wants to be out on a day like this?"
Just you be thankful we've got any work to do at all, replied Henrietta. Better than being someone's chicken coop.
Toby laughed, but his smile disappeared as the tunnel came into view. The dark skies made it hard to see to the end. As Toby puffed through, a huge crack of lightning came down, illuminating the inside of the tunnel. "Goodness!" gasped Toby. In the flash, he thought he saw a young man leaning against the tunnel wall. Then, ouch! And the brakes came on. Toby stopped, his buffers just peeking out of the tunnel. The fireman stomped out. "Ridiculous!" he shouted. "Another backblast!" Sure enough, there was a small red welt on his hand. Mrs. Kindly came down from the cottage. "Come out to the house, dearie," she said to the fireman. "We'll bandage you up." The driver pulled the train out of the tunnel, while the guard explained the situation to the passengers. Mr. Kindly came out too. "Weather got you down, Toby?" he asked. "No, sir. It's something else." Toby told him everything. You say you saw a young man in the flash of lightning?" quizzed Mr. Kindly. "Yes, sir," said Toby, "but he just stood there. He made no attempt to avoid us." Mr. Kindly's face fell. "Oh dear," he sighed. "Maybe he is still there after all." Toby was puzzled. Who, sir?" Mr. Kindly took a deep breath and began. "I remember back when this branch line was being built. A crew of young workers had been sent to dig a tunnel through the hill. They were all wonderful boys, but I remember Clive the best. He always knew the best way to get a laugh out of you. The missus and I made good friends with those boys, and we often had them in on their lunch breaks, or had them stay for dinner when the day's work was done. One day, a storm was raging. Clive had gone into the tunnel to make sure the supports were secure. One of the workers was about to go join him. Suddenly, there was a crack and a shout, 'Get out of the tunnel!' The next thing I knew, dust and dirt came pouring out of the tunnel mouth. The boys were frantic, and we started to dig away at the dirt as quickly as we could, but..." He trailed off, composing himself. "Clive didn't make it. The boys couldn't deal with what had happened and resigned. They had to hire a new team to finish the tunnel. I believe Clive is still in there, though." "You do?" Toby asked. Mr. Kindly nodded. "Sometimes, when I'm out in the garden, I can hear the sound of shovels digging away at the earth. Often I'll hear, 'Morning, Mr. Kindly,' from within the tunnel. I always run down to check, but there's never anyone there. You know, Toby, I think Clive may be the one behind your incidents." "Well, I do wish he'd stop," Toby sighed. "My fireman might resign if this nonsense keeps up." "Believe it or not, Toby, I don't think it's happening out of spite," said Mr. Kindly. "Clive enjoyed a bit of fun, but would never wish harm on anyone." He paused impressively. "I think he's trying to tell you something." "But why me? Thomas has never had anything odd happen in the tunnel." Mr. Kindly paused. "Young Thomas has a good heart," he said, "but he's still rather, naive. I believe Clive is reaching out to a wiser, more experienced presence. And that's you, Toby." Just then, the fireman came out of the cottage with Mrs. Kindly. "Good as new," he said to Toby. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Kindly smiled. "Oh, do take care now. Let's not make this a habit, eh, Toby?" Toby smiled, but couldn't find the strength to laugh. As the train set off again, Mr. Kindly gave Toby a sympathetic look, then turned to the tunnel and sighed. "What's the matter, dear?" Mrs. Kindly asked. "Oh, just a bit of reminiscing is all," he replied. Toby was lost in thought. He could hear Elsie grumbling as they trundled along, but he didn't pay much attention. Elsie grumbled quite often, and he and Henrietta had learned to tune it out. But at the station, the guard called for Toby's crew. "Have a look at this, lads!" They were amazed to see a large dent on Elsie's roof.
Paying attention now, are you? No one heard me in the tunnel, and you ignored me all the way here. Nasty old tunnel. Poor old Elsie, she wailed. Something must have fallen from the roof, pondered the guard. We'll take a look next time we go through. That was enough for Toby. First his fireman, and now Elsie. No more of this, he said to himself. He was determined not to let some ghost bring harm to his friends. Late that afternoon, the rain bucketed down. The crew kept dry under Tidmouth Station's roof. Toby sat silent, the rain running down his sides. "Rain doesn't usually upset you," worried Henrietta. "It isn't the rain," Toby replied. "I'm thinking of what Mr. Kindly said. Do you really think the tunnel could be haunted?" Henrietta was pensive. "I've seen many things in my time," she went on, "but the paranormal is something I can't quite put my wheels on." "I worry what will happen next time we go through that tunnel," continued Toby. "My back glass? Elsie being damaged? What if something happens to you?" "I'll be fine," Henrietta smiled. "You worry about getting your work done." The crew came to ready Toby for his next run. As they set off, Henrietta tried to be brave, but secretly she was a little nervous. As they journeyed down the branch line, the rumbling thunder shook the rails. Toby couldn't tell if it was the thunder or fear which made his wheels tremble. At Kindly Cottage, Toby rang his bell and gulped. The tunnel mouth came into view. "Here we go," he said to no one. Elsie kept on grumbling, but Henrietta remained in silent anticipation. At once, darkness enveloped the train. Save for Toby's puffing, all was silent. "Help!" Toby's brakes screeched on, and still in the tunnel, he ground to a halt. "What's going on?" he asked. "You've left us behind!" Henrietta's voice echoed. The guard jumped down from Henrietta's veranda and pulled out a flashlight, shining it at the front coupling. "The chain is still intact!" he gasped. Toby's crew, who had come back to look, were puzzled. They examined Toby's coupling hook and found nothing amiss. "What on earth?" began the driver, scratching his head. "Look!" shrilled Toby. His lamp shone to the tunnel's exit. It seemed as though something was piled on the tracks. The guard and crew walked up to the tunnel mouth and shone the flashlight. "It's soil!" At that moment, the fireman felt something fall on his cap. The men looked up. The soil above the tunnel was shifting. "The rain must have loosened the earth and is causing it to shift down the slope," the guard concluded. "We'll have to get back in the tunnel!" called a frantic voice. The men leaped back inside just as the earth gave way, crashing down onto the rails and blocking Toby's view. Everyone was astonished. The guard broke the silence. "We must go back to the station and let them know what's happened. Let's get out of here before we risk getting stuck for good." The crew agreed and began walking back to Toby's cab. "Thanks for the warning, old boy," said the driver, patting Toby's buffer. "You certainly saved our backs. I'd say this more than makes up for the burns." But, stammered Toby, "I didn't say anything." As he reversed, his lamps caught the shape of a young man leaning against the tunnel wall. Toby smiled knowingly. "Thank you," he said. Clive tipped his cap, walked towards the barricaded exit, and disappeared. The rain subsided, and within the week, workmen had repaired the tunnel. Toby had no further incidents following the repairs, and felt better about going through the tunnel. He knew Clive never meant to harm anyone. He was only trying to get someone's attention to prevent a greater tragedy from occurring. Toby always rings his bell as he exits the tunnel, for both Clive and the Kindlies to hear. It was the tram engine's special way of saying thank you to the ghost of the tunnel.